Wow. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in. And we're going to continue. We're back in this book, The 10 Tribes of Israel, historically identified with the aborigines of the Western Hemisphere by Mrs. Simon. And this is from 1836, as you guys see right here. We are going to go continue where we left off, parts we haven't read from this book. We're going to go ahead and get that today. All right. Appreciate you guys again making the time to be here and read along with me. Thank you very much for that. And again, we're just talking about the true old world. And yeah, many nations were here. And of course, that would include what you call the so-called Israelite tribes. What we're trying to show you is that there is a real people. When it comes to biblical characters, biblical stories, there is a real history. And that was found here. When the Europeans got here, they realized, and a lot of them wrote about it, and they said, hey, look at this. This is so similar to these ancient people, what the Indians are doing. And so again, I'm not here, and it's not about religion. It's not about history. We're not reading the Bible, of course, we're reading history. All right, make that clear. So we go to page 86 of this book. We go to this real quick chapter. It's literally just 3 pages, but we're going to read it before we get to the other one. And it says here, Theocratic government. It says, Baron Humboldt, discoursing on the theocratic form of government of the Sac, the Volga, and Peruvians, remarks that by the tradition of the former, the government was founded by a mysterious personage who lived in the temple of the Supreme Light 2,000 years ago, of Quetzalcoatl, which signifies the serpent with green feathers. They say he introduced the boring of the ear, and that he walked barefoot, himself seeking as a chosen place of retirement the volcano Setzep, or mountain of speech. He held the reins of government, taught them to cast metals, ordered fast, and regulated the intercalations of the Toltec year. Though their ancient legislator is called by a name importing a serpent with green feathers, yet he was an ancient man and white-bearded. They're saying with white beard, that could be white folks, black folks have black white beard as well. Like, don't think complexion. This is the hijack. They always try to say, oh, they're white-bearded man, and they always want you to think so-called pale-skinned people. But anyways, what they're trying to tell you is that this guy is not just symbolically something or a drakam, but an ancient man called by Montezuma a holy man who led and taught them many things. Don Alonso Ercilla says in his History of Chile, the religious belief of the Araucanians is sublime. Araucan. They acknowledge a supreme being, whom they denominate by a word expressive of supreme essence. They also call him the Spirit of Heaven, the Great Life, the Thunderer, the Omnipotent, the Eternal, the Infinite. The government of this glorious Creator is a prototype of their polity. They are all agreed in the immortality of the soul. This animating and consolatory truth is deeply rooted and innate with them. They hold that man is formed of 2 substances essentially different, the corruptible body and the incorruptible, the eternal spirit. They have a tradition that the earth was covered with water, yet not destroyed, and that the same earth shall be covered with fire, but not destroyed. All right, listen. There shall be great signs before the end. Locke, one of the ablest men Great Britain ever produced, observes that the commonwealth of the Jews differed from all others, being an absolute theocracy. The laws established there concerning the worship of the one invisible deity were the civil laws of that people, and a part of their political government, in which God himself was the legislator. In this observes Dr. Bodino, the Indians profess the same thing precisely. This is the exact form of their government, which seems unaccountable were it not derived from the same original source, and is the only reason that can be assigned for so extraordinary a fact, the same source as the Israelites, huh? It may be said that the Jews were long governed by judges and kings, but these were not of their appointment, but of the appointment of God under him as his substitutes or vicegerents. Blessed be the Lord thy God, who delighted in thee to set thee on his throne to be king for the Lord thy God. Again, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, and I should not reign over them. Again, and now ye think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hands of the sons of David, agreeably to the theocracy or divine government of Israel. The Indians think the deity to be the immediate head of their state. All the nations of the Indians have inexpressible contempt of the European people. They used to call us, in their war orations, the accursed people, but they flattered themselves with the name of the beloved people, because their supposed ancestors, as they affirm, were under the immediate government of the deity, who was present with them in a very peculiar manner and directed them by prophets, while the rest of the world were aliens and outlaws to the covenant, the agreement. Huh? When the old Archimagus or any of their magi is persuading the people at their religious solemnities to strict observance of the old beloved or divine speech, he always calls them the beloved or holy people, agreeably to the Hebrew epithet Ami, my people, during the theocracy of Israel. It is their opinion of their theocracy that God chose them out of all the rest of mankind as his peculiar people. When any of their beloved people die, they soften the thoughts of death by saying, he is only gone to sleep with the beloved forefathers, and usually mention a common proverb among them, Netak intaha, the days appointed, or allowed him, were finished. And this is their firm belief, for they affirm that there is a fixed time and place where every one must die, without any possibility of averting it. They frequently say such a one was weighed on the path and made to be light. They always ascribe life and death to God's unerring and particular providence. All right. And that was the end of that chapter. So I'm saying a quick chapter. We're on page 89. We're going to continue, of course, reading. This is a longer chapter. This is called the religious observances. All right. So let's see what they have to say here. Again, they're getting all this from what the accounts or records are have been, or what people have said in the past. From first eye view, being with them, living with them, seeing them, encountering them, and then talking to them, getting their stories and things like that, reading their codices, reading their migration legends and all that, right? So it says religious observances and everything relating to the treatment of the Mexican children, even in the mode of punishing them. The Mexicans resemble the Jews. Huh. Torquemada has also observed that festivals took place at the naming of the infant, and afterwards on its being weaned, omitting further mention of baptismal ceremonies and the use of circumcision, both which it may be presumed on the authority of very ancient writers were in use amongst the Mexicans. And nothing did the civil policy of the Mexicans more closely resemble that of the Hebrews than in their dedication or dedicating their children to the temple. Listen, and afterwards sending them to be instructed by the master or superior rabbi in the doctrines of their religion and moral ceremonial laws. Torquemada says that the ceremony of dedicating their children to the military profession was also a religious one. He continues, I likewise wish it to be noticed that the devil commanded amongst this vain Indian people that the first thing a father bid his children do should be to love and honor their gods. So they blame the devil for that. You see that? These Spanish chroniclers. Of the excellent nature, however, of the moral precepts which the Mexican parents inculcated on the minds of their children, the same author is a witness where, adducing the authority of the book of Ecclesiasticus in favor of the early education of children, quoting the 7th chapter, page 230, he says, the Indians strictly fulfilled this doctrine. This doctrine, adds Torquemada, we shall find wonderfully approved amongst the Indians of the territory of New Spain, who not only took care to nourish their children with food and bodily ailments for the sake of strengthening their bodies, but also with admirable moral doctrines in order to render them rational and proper members of a civil community, and that they might live the life which has been allotted to them as befitted those who possess minds capable of reason and order, since the doctrines of those Indians are characterized with much prudence and counsel. I will not omit to record their conversations and exhortations to their children, since from them it will be apparent that neither natural law nor that of grace nor human policy could demand more, as far as moral policy is concerned, setting aside the knowledge of the true God. All right, that's what Torquemada is saying. And real quick, just for context, and so just so you can know who they're quoting, what time frames we got here, guys. Remember, this is a long time ago when they're saying Mexicans, talking about ancient people who lived in the territory today called Mexico, or at least not ancient, but during the time when the Spanish, so-called Spanish, came, right? So this Tomás de Torquemada, that's who they're quoting right now, who just said what he just said, right? And comparing them to the ancient Israelites and Hebrews, he was a Roman Catholic Dominican friar. We found out the other day these friars, a lot of them are crypto Jews. They were they had converted. So, remember that. And also, he was the first Castilian Grand Inquisitor of the Tribunal of the Holy Office, which was a group of ecclesiastical prelates created in 1478 and charged with the somewhat ill-defined task of upholding Catholic religious orthodoxy within the lands of the newly formed Union of the Crowns of Castile and Aragon, presently known as the Kingdom of Spain. Okay, so that included their, colonies that they had conquered, and so that was in New Spain, America. That's what we're talking about. So Thomas Torquemada, that's who we're reading about right here. He's talking about how, what they were doing with their children resembles what the Hebrews were doing. It says these exhortations were translated from the Mexican language into the Spanish by the Venerable Father Andrew de Olms, a brother of the Order of the Glorious Father, St. Francis, who labored in this vineyard, a new plantation of the Holy Gospel, with the greatest diligence, undergoing great and numerous hardships, and laying the foundation of this new church. All right, so again, I forgot to mention before we continue, Torquemada lived between 1420 and 1498, guys. So this is even before 1500s. He's writing all this, right? When they just get here in the 1490s, 1492, right? So then now this guy is translating the work he's saying, which exhortations in the Mexican language I have in my possession, and I can venture to affirm that neither the said Father de Olms nor the Lord Bishop of Chiapa, Don Bartolomeu Las Casas, who obtained them from him, nor I, who now own them and have bestowed pains on understanding them and thoroughly comprehending their metaphors, have known how to translate them in the same softness and sweetness as the natives utter them in their own language. Or they talking about translations of their writings or sayings, right? Facsimiles. They impressed upon them the duty of serving the gods, carrying the children with them to the temples on appointed days and hours in order that they might acquire a liking for the same teaching when they should live separate from them and become fathers of families. All right, you guys hear that? The early Spanish writers have not failed to point out some curious traits of resemblance to Hebrew usages in certain acts performed by the kings and Incas, and in the external marks of reverence these monarchs received from their subjects. These consisted in their kings presiding at sacrifices, dancing on great religious festivals, and being consecrated to the regal dignity by the hands of the high priest with a pretended holy unction, and being invested with a crown and bracelets as the insignia of majesty, and his wearing a signet or signet on his arm, and his reading his garments on receiving intelligence of any national calamity, and his saluting with a kiss the general who brought him tidings of a victory, and his employing regular couriers for the dispatch of public matters, and the ceremonies with which his subjects were accustomed to enter the palace, taken off their sandals, as in the temples of the gods, as not looking the king in the face, but addressing him with their eyes on the ground, and finally, and burning incense and precious perfumes at his funeral. Herrera remarks that the priests of the Vitsli Putzli were entitled to succeed to their office by being born of families resident in certain suburbs of the city, especially marked out for their purpose. Numbers 153, it says the dress was a crimson vest resembling a robe, with open sleeves to which were fastened fringes as a border. Page 69. Amongst the Jews, all wars, not excepting their civil ones, bore a religious character. And in the 12th chapter of Deuteronomy, directions are given to the priest to accompany and exhort the soldiers to battle. The interpreter of the collection of Mendoza says that the priests likewise followed the Mexican armies, listen, just like the Israelites did, not only for the purpose of joining the combatants, but also to perform certain religious ceremonies, in which some analogy is discovered between the customs of the two nations. All right, doing the same thing. Talking about warrior priests, huh? Warrior priests. It has already been observed that many analogies might be pointed out in the usages of the Mexicans and Jews, so-called Jews, right? Israelites, who they're talking about here, in reference to their treatment of their kings, but omitting in this place to notice the oath which was administered to the kings of Mexico at their coronation by the high priest, which is described by Gomara, page 122 of his History of the Conquest of Mexico. Again, these are from primary sources in which the kings made a covenant with the people to protect the established religion, to preserve the laws, and to maintain justice, reminding us of what David did on a similar occasion, as recorded by Samuel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and the great burning of spices and other odoriferous substances which took place at the funerals of the kings of Mexico, which was also customary at the funerals of the Jewish kings, Israelite kings, and we shall remark that the regalia worn by the kings of both nations, listen, were nearly the same. So what do we say, guys? Like if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, dresses like a duck, does ceremonies like a duck, if they both, then they must be a duck, right? Then it must be an Israelite, so-called Israelite. Talking about biblical people, real history. Talking about the true old world. Amongst the Israelites, they consisted of a crown and bracelets, as is evident from 2 Samuel 1:18, where the Amalekite announces to David the death of Saul, bringing him not with his sword and armor, but what he thought would be a more agreeable present to an aspirant to the throne, the royal insignia. A scepter was also part of the Israelite regalia and a mantle. The crown of the Israelite king more nearly resembled a mitre than the crown worn by the emperors and monarchs. A crown and bracelets, scepter, and mantle constituted, though not the entire, the principal part of the royal custom of the Mexican kings. The crown was named Teocatli and the bracelets Coscalt, and they are both represented in the 57th plate in the collection of Mendoza as forming a specimen of the dress worn by the Mexican kings, since the regal apparel of Montezuma differed but slightly from that of Moquihuix. It is true, as a general remark, that both nations in their costume and the external decoration of their persons and buildings nearly resembled each other. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm. And it is very singular, since there was something peculiar in the Hebrew fashion, that this should have been a Mexican custom likewise, as we learn from Cortés, Torquemada, and Bernal Diaz. They all wrote about it, guys. This is what I'm trying to show you. They didn't read this stuff to us. They didn't show us the background, the context of what they were talking. They didn't make us picture, like they don't try to make movies about this stuff, because it literally will resemble the biblical people. Torquemada says in the 20th chapter of the 8th book of his Indian monarchy that the priests and ministers who lived in the great temple of Mexico were more than 5,000, who resided by day and by night within its walls, occupied in the service of the temple. These priests are constantly named Levites by Acosta. Listen, these priests are constantly named Levites by Acosta. Why would Acosta be calling them Levites if they weren't? And certainly that learned author, a learned person too, may be excused for giving them that appellation, as the temple service of the Mexicans was in reality very like that of the Israelites. All right, page 281, go get the primary source. The offerings of the Mexicans consisted, like those of the Israelites, in the lives of animals or blood, incense, and the first fruits, which, like the Israelites, they presented 3 times a year, which Torquemada undertakes in the following manner to explain. It is certainly a thing calculated to create astonishment to see, in their offerings of the first fruits, the two republics resemble each other. But we need not feel so much surprise at it, since it was the devil who persuaded and instigated them, who, as we have proved in the whole course of this history, wished to substitute himself for God, remedar a Dios. So this is the whole excuse that these Spanish chroniclers were using as to why the Indians knew so much of the biblical stories, because the devil had told it to them. This is the only reasoning. You guys believe that? We're gonna dodge the hijack with that. But whatever we're letting you know, pay attention to what he's telling you. Literally, they were doing, how they were practicing things, how they dressed. He couldn't hide that part. He couldn't make that up. He's writing, he's letting you know his honest opinion. Damn, man, that looks like the ancient people of the Bible, the way they're doing it. So when he's saying, yeah, they're copying God, the devil's trying to copy God here, remedar a Dios. And that's why they knew so much. Whenever it was possible. And this being the case, the task was more easy, inasmuch as these Indians are extremely addicted to religious worship. He found little trouble in inducing them to tender to him this kind of offering and sacrifice, which, as we have observed, all paid very generally and regularly without being either remiss in the offering or inexact in its proper quantity. Monarchia Indiana, chapter 21, book 8, in Antiquities of Mexico. The interpreter of the larger Vatican manuscript says that the light was obliged to be always kept burning in the Mexican temples, and instancing this and other traits of resemblance between the Mexicans and the Israelites. He shortly afterwards adds, from all these circumstances, the fact is plain and probable that this nation descends from the Hebrews. All right, the ancient Mexicans, since all the ceremonies of this chapter are, as it were, according to the text in Leviticus. They're doing everything just like it's written in Leviticus. Listen, these are primary sources telling you this, right? People who saw them when they got here, such as that the people shall not touch the holy things. And again, as in Exodus, that light should be always in the temple, and incense and trumpets and sacred vestments. Page 66. Sina Teocalli was the proper name of a Mexican temple, and which may be recognized as forming part of a compound name. The word Sina, which corresponds exactly with the word Sinai or Sinai, right? Sina, Sinai, Sinaloa, huh? Remember, the mountain from which God delivered the laws and tables of stone to Moses. And if you pay attention when you're reading the whole story of Moses and that part where he's on Mount Sinai is literally sounds like it's a volcano, all right, a real volcano. So where are volcanoes? Are there any volcanoes over there in what they call in the Holy Land today? It's accompanying symbol. So Sina, right? Sina Teocalli. Its accompanying symbol is 2 rows of arrow-headed characters engraved upon a single table of stone. Similar rows of character occur in the 65th and 73rd pages of the larger Vatican manuscript, and in the 3rd page of the first part of the Codex. The expression arrow-headed characters and table of stone is applied here rather improperly to these symbols, in order to point out the possibility of the enclosed square representing a table of stone and of the lines which it contains alluding to alphabetical writing. A respectable writer says that the inhabitants of Florida, listen, made use in their religious songs of the exclamation, Hosanna, 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 huh? Sana, Sanai, listen, Sana, Sina, Loa, Sin, Sana. And their priests were named Jehovah's. Their priests were named what? Jehovah's. 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 Collection of Mendoza, page 71. Come on now. I can't make this up. Listen, pay attention. This ain't about religion. We're talking about a real people, a real history. It is certainly curious that the Mexican mode of fortification seemed chiefly to have consisted in their temples, which were also like that of Jerusalem arsenals, just like in Jerusalem, and in the thick walls which surrounded their cities, protected on the outside by a fosse with ramparts above. Okay? The Incas of Peru wore a tassel on the forehead. They wore what? A tassel on the forehead as the insignia of royalty, with which, considering that they accounted themselves the representatives of Veracocha or Verachocha, might have served to remind them to keep his laws. And like the robes worn by the Moscas, have been an imitation of the dress of Bachica. The Muiscas, all right, that's Bachica in Colombia, which is Veracocha, which is Quetzalcoatl. The mitre upon the head of Shugamoxti, the founder of the empire of Botoca, and those upon the heads of the 10th and 11th Incas of Peru are very deserving of notice and remind us that the Incas of Peru and the Sipas of Bogota or Botoga considered a priest the founder of their respective dynasties. They're telling you it's very much the same, what it represents. And I've shown you images of that. I've shown you the stones where they depict the person with, the one tassel coming out, right? The mitre does indeed seem to have observed the place of the crown in the New World. For the copili, or copilli, worn by the Mexican monarchs, was a half mitre. Listen, the true old world who wore mitres, right? And the coincidence is curious that all the native Indian monarchs at the period of the discovery of America by the Spaniards should have worn mitres as the insignia of royalty. Listen, this is the real old world. Costa says that the Inca, after confession, walked into an adjoining river, bidding its waters receive his sins and carry them into the sea, that he might be rid of their power. Look at that. The sins, like baptizing yourself, like coming again, being washed, right? Washing away your sins in a river, right? In the 212th page of the first volume of the religious customs of all nations, the following passage occurs. The ancient Hebrews formerly laid all their sins upon a he-goat, which they afterwards drove into the desert. But the modern Israelites, instead of a goat, now throw them on the water. After dinner, they repair to the brink of a pond and then shake their clothes over it with all their might. This practice is taken from the 19th verse of the 7th chapter of Micah. The Israelites, as well as the Peruvians, entertain a notion that the sins of the fathers were visited upon the children. Page 301. The Incas went to war for the express purpose of bringing the other tribes over to their faith. You guys hear that? Accordingly, we find that from New Mexico to the extreme province of Chile, which resisted successfully the invasion of the Incas, the same religion with different modifications of rites and ceremonies prevailed, and circumcision, although not universally practiced, was one of its characteristics. Page 306. Sahagún says in the 14th chapter of his first book, and mentioned in the festival of Xujiquilt, that the Mexicans ate on one of their fast unleavened bread. Unleavened bread. It deserves to be remarked that as amongst the Israelites, certain cities were appointed as cities of refuge. All right, they're saying the Mexicans had that, just like the North American Indians had towns of refuge or cities of refuge, to which criminals might fly and escape the punishment of the laws. So amongst the Mexicans and other Indian states, there were appointed places of refuge to which culprits might fly and claim the rights of sanctuary. Can you guys imagine that? There was places like that. The Indians had places like that. Dr. Bodinath observes in almost every Indian nation there are several peaceable towns called Old Beloved, Ancient Holy, or White Towns. They seem to have been formerly towns of refuge, for it is not in the memory of their oldest people that ever human blood was shed in them, although they often forced persons from thence and put them to death elsewhere. Star in the West. The places of refuge amongst the southern Indians were the palaces of their kings called by the Mexicans Teptan or Tecpan, yeah. Wherever there was a palace, there was a city of refuge, likewise. But it may also be inferred, although it is not stated by the Indian writers, that the Mexican Teocalli, or the pyramids, especially the Greater Temple of Mexico, were places of refuge, and that the city of Cholula was a city of refuge. You guys hear that? It is unnecessary to quote scripture to show that to offer incense in their temple was a Jewish custom or Israelite custom, since no nation ever came so near the Israelites in their prodigality in making this offering to the deity. But it deserves to be remarked that the Israelites were expressly commanded in the 40th verse of the 23rd chapter of Leviticus to carry boughs and branches of trees in their hands as a religious ceremony. And you shall take to you on the first day boughs and branches of godly trees, and of a palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. All right. The Mexicans were accustomed to their temples decorate their temples profusely with boughs of trees and flowers, and to carry them in their hands in certain festive processions. Right? Listen. It is said in the 31st chapter of Exodus of the Israelites, and they came both men and women, as many as were willing hearted, and brought bracelets and earrings and tablets, all jewels of gold, and every man offered of an offering of gold unto the Lord. The Mexican paintings show them that the Mexicans were accustomed to present at the shrine of their gods jewels of gold, bracelets, and necklaces, and it would also appear that they placed loaves of bread in the sanctuary of their temples before their idols, which must remind us of the Israelite showbread. Acosta describing in the ninth chapter of the fifth volume of his natural and moral history of the Indies the adoration which the Mexicans paid to their three principal deities of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, says Prater, all right, see the Antiquities of Mexico, volume 6, it says page 292. Torquemada says that in one of the Mexican months, the Mexicans celebrated a festival by going up to a neighboring mountain and building a kind of tabernacle with boughs for one of their principal idols. In the 40s, they're calling them idols, right? In the 42nd plate of the first part of the monuments of M. Dupax, remember we got his whole voyage to Palenque, right? Where he described there all the similarities with the Israelites and ancient Egyptians and ancient Romans and old world people, everything he was finding there in Palenque and all that, right? So, Monsieur Dupas, under number 97, a stone table occurs in relievo containing four figures seated and having a very Israelite cast of countenance with long beards. This is what they find in there, right? In Palenque, one of whom holds what appears to be a branch or palm or willow in his hand. Between them in the center is the place of a temple. Exultation is evidently depicted in their countenances, while there is something votive in their attitude. Page 292. The purple veils said to have been spread before the shrine of Tezcatlipoca, all right, purple, right, purple royalty, and to have been painted with skulls and bones. Skull and bones recalls to our recollection the 35th verse of the 36th chapter of Exodus, in which mentions is made of the veil of the tabernacle. Okay, same thing. It says Torquemada says that the skulls and bones which occupy the place of the cherubims in the temple of Tezcatlipoca signified that God possessed equal power over life and death. In the same way as amongst the Israelites, none were permitted except the Levites to enter the place of sanctuary. So the Mexican ritual forbade any but the priest to enter the sanctuary of Tezcatlipoca. All right, they did the same exact things. Listen, Acosta describing the temple of that god in the 13th of the 5th book says, as the temple in Jerusalem, just like in Jerusalem, the temple contained great store of gold and silver vessels, which the king of Babylon pillaged, so the Peruvian temples were excessively rich in precious vases, especially that of Pachacamac near Lima, from which Acosta observes Francis Pizarro and his soldiers obtained immense quantities of gold and silver vases, just like is written in the Bible. And when we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it over and over again. Repeating the second. It was customary among the Israelites to summon the people to worship by the sounding of horns and to blow trumpets was a religious ceremony which Moses declared in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus that God himself appointed. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation. And again in the 29th chapter of Numbers, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of the trumpets unto you. It is not a little curious that according to Torquemada, the Mexicans should have been summoned to prayer at stated hours by the blowing of horns. Come on now, guys, doing the same exact thing by the blowing of horns. In the same way as the Israelites, although they were acquainted with bells, and that according to Garcia, they should have approached the temple with the same reverential custom of pulling off their sandals when within a certain number of paces distant from it. See Exodus 3. They have likewise imitated the Israelites in their sacerdotal custom. And Garcia, in the 2nd chapter of the 36 of the accounts of the Indians, treating of the resemblance of the Indian dress to that of the Israelites. All right, this is a primary source. He says, Father Agustín Davila, arcobispo de Santo Domingo, reserve on su Historia Dominicana del Nuevo Mundo, como en un pueblo llamado Tamaculapa, que es en la Mixteca de Nayarón, unas vestiduras sagradas de al que ellos teían por escondidas los indios. The Archobispo of Saint Domingo relates in his Historia Dominicana of the New World that some sacred vestments were discovered in a town called Tecpan in Mexico, which had belonged to the person whom they considered the high priest, which nearly resembled those worn by the high priest of the Mexican nation, which vestments the Indians kept concealed. In the 12th part of the manuscript in the Bodleian Library, which seems to represent the migration of the Mexicans or some other subject connected with a descent into hell, and which is unfortunately only a fragment of a large painting, from which a part has evidently been torn off, the figure of a Mexican priest occurs in a dress very like that of the high priest of the Jews or Israelites, just like the Israelites. The linen ephod, the breastplate, and the border of pomegranates, right? Promised land, pomegranates, right? Described in the Exodus are there represented. The Mexicans wore this stuff. Listen, talking about ancient people living in a territory called Mexico when the Spanish, so-called Spanish, got there in colonial times, right? The golden bells are wanting, but those ornaments will be found in the valuable paintings preserved in the Royal Library at Dresden, attached to the dress of several of the figures, as was ordained in the 20th chapter of Exodus, in the use of the dress of the Israelitish high priest. Gomara has observed that a girdle sometimes formed part of the Mexican costume. The head of the above-mentioned priest seems to be ornamented with ribbons, interwoven with the hair. All right, interwoven with the hair ribbons, but the Mexican teocatli, or crown, which bore a much closer resemblance to the headdress of Aaron. Listen, just like the headdress of who? Aaron, the brother of Moses, right? Then the episcopal mitre is represented in the same page of the Oxford manuscript on the head of another figure. It also frequently occurs among the paintings of the College of Mendoza and is there always painted blue. This crown of mitre was worn by the Mexican kings and likewise by the judges. The former had it richly adorned with plates of gold. Those kings, it is supposed, united pontifical with regal dignity. All right. Again, this is what they're finding them dressed like. We're not talking about savage people, talking people dressed just like the people in the Bible. Although the ostensible head of the Mexican religion was the high priest, who at his consecration to the office was anointed with oil, just like in Exodus 29, page 296. That's from the primary source, right? Thou shalt make a plate of pure gold. So this is the Exodus, right? This is what he just described the Indians looking like this, right? And here he gives you the verse that says the exact same thing in the Bible. Thou shalt make a plate of pure gold, engrave upon it like the engravings of a signet, holiness unto the Lord, and thou shalt put it on a blue lace, that it may be upon the mitre, upon the forehead of the mitre shall it be. These things deserve to be noticed in the Mexican mitre. It frequently consisted of a plate of gold and a blue ground. Listen, the exact same, man. Come on now. It was tied to the hair by a lace or ribbon and was perpetually worn on the forehead of the kings or the high priest. The breastplate of the high priest is described in Exodus 28, right? Listen, the breastplates of the Mexicans appear to have been of different shapes and sizes and to have been set with precious stones. Come on now, just like the Israelites. I hope you guys understand what I'm reading here to you, what I'm showing you. In the 13th page of the original Mexican paintings preserved in the library of the Vatican, the figure of a priest occurs with a round breastplate attached by a chain to his neck, and near him appears to be two other breastplates, one square and the other of a round form. All right, one square, just like Israelites. It is to be supposed that so solemn an injunction to the Israelites to wear fringes on the borders of their garments would be scrupulously obeyed throughout their generations. Reference to the 8th page of the Oxford manuscript will show that it was a Mexican custom to wear fringes and borders fastened to their apparel. And an examination of any of the Mexican paintings contained in this volume will establish the fact. Okay? You guys see? It's the same. One's real history, one's just a biblical story in a book that people were reading in Europe about ancient America. Antiquities of Mexico, right? Page 299. Acosta, in the 25th chapter of the 5th book of his natural and moral history of the Indies, says Daniel's description and his vision resembles a passage in the 9th chapter of the 6th book of Sahagun's history of New Spain, in which the newly elected king of Mexico returns thanks to the God of heaven, the God of years. The following is the passage alluded to. Who am I, O Lord, and what account that thou shoutest or shouldest place me in the rank of those whom thou regardest and knowest and numberest among thine allies and elect, whom thou dost esteem as persons sustaining the highest honor, and such as are born and educated for dignity and royal thrones, and accordingly has endowed them with talents and wisdom. Select them for that purpose, those who are descended from noble and illustrious lineage, who have been brought up with the expectations, and who have been baptized in the signs and constellations which preside at the birth of kings, that they might become thy instruments, thy images to govern kingdoms, thou being in them and speaking by their mouth, and thy declaring thy words, and thus they might, in conformity to the will of their ancient God and Father of God, even the God of fire, whose habitation is in the waters, which battlements and encompasses were where he dwells, surrounded with works as it were of roses, whose name is Shuiletisutli, who determines, examines, and brings to an issue the controversy of the multitudes, cleansing thy people as it were with water, before whom are ever present in attendance the noble ones. All right. You know, and I literally thought I was reading like a passage from the Bible. All right. But that was actually one of their codices, the ancient Mexican codices. Both nations, example, Hebrews and Mexicans, were most punctual at the payment of their religious offerings and first fruits. Mexicans, as Montezuma informed Cortes, feared if they failed in this part of their religious duties that they would incur the severest vengeance. And the prophet Malachi, sorry, or rather, God speaking through the mouth of that prophet, assures that the Israelites that they were under a peculiar blessing promised in the third chapter of the book of Malachi. It says here the paintings of the Mexicans show that censers were used in profusion in the ceremonies of their religion. The priests lodged round the temples in chambers built for the express purpose, and it appears from the 27th verse of the 9th chapter of Chronicles that a certain portion of the Levites lodged round the temple built by Solomon. The Mexican temples contain fountains in the courts in which the priests performed the ablutions, and Solomon is said to have made a molten sea which contained 2,000 baths, which served the same purpose, and stood in the court of the temple. Everything relating to preserving unextinguished the sacred fire which burnt in the temple was considered by the Mexicans as a matter of the utmost consequence. The manner in which they kindled the sacred fire is not precisely known. That it was a religious rite accompanied with certain ceremonies cannot be doubted, and we may even be permitted to believe from an expression in the 14th verse of the 19th chapter of Ezekiel, and fire has gone forth from a rod of her branches, which have devoured her fruits, that they were acquainted with the Mexican method of kindling fire by wood. Many passages of scripture led us to imagine that the ground plan of the great temple of Mexico resembled that of Jerusalem. All right? Reasons for supposing that the Mexicans were acquainted with the book of Job will be found at page 382 of this volume, Mexican Antiquities. And their custom of shaving their hair, sitting upon the ground, and sprinkling dust upon their heads as a sign of humiliation closely resembles what is said in the first chapter of that book of the mourning of Job and his friends, all right? Pages 523 to 5. According to rabbinical doctrine, the accusations of Satan were confounded by the noise of the trumpets which Moses commanded the priests to blow on their solemn festivals, and which the Mexicans, as it were in compliance with the precept contained in the 8th verse of the 10th chapter of Numbers, and the priests and the sons of Aaron shall blow with the trumpets, and they shall be to you an ordinance throughout your generations. Continually sounded in the courts of their temples. Thus, the Mexicans did this, a custom which the interpreter of the Vatican Codex believed they had borrowed from the Hebrews, as he unequivocally declares on page 224 of the present volume, Antiquities of Mexico. You guys hear that, right? They were writing all this stuff, all these different chroniclers, so-called Spanish, so-called Portuguese, a lot of them, we already know crypto Muslims, crypto Jews, but they were seeing it, experiencing it, and writing it, and putting in all their little books here and there. And this is the history they never taught us. They didn't want us to think, oh, people resembling biblical people or the Israelites were found here. Huh? In connection with this typical silencing of the enemy and avenger, a striking passage occurs with respect to the perfection of praise from guileless lips. The Mexicans believe that the intercession of children in behalf of men are efficacious with God. We shall quote a remarkable passage from the 21st chapter of Sahagun's history in confirmation of this curious fact. And it says, they say that it is for their sake that God preserved the world, and that they are our intercessors with God. which passage adds Aglio, deserves to be considered in connection with what is said of children in the 8th Psalm. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of the enemy and the avenger. Pages 517 to 18. Of the same peculiarity of belief, the interpreter goes on to observe, they believed that they were dear to God, and that they interceded with him for men, that at their death they went to heaven and were nourished by the tree distilling milk, which grew in the garden of Tona Kateotli, where they ever abided in the presence of Tona Kateotli. The name of the tree was Chichualquanil, and representation of it will be found in the 5th page of the Lesser Vatican manuscript. When we recollect what is said in the New Testament of little children and the mysterious words, take heed that ye offend not one of these little ones who believe in me. For in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. Considering at the same time that the signification of Tonacuatitlan is the place where grows the tree of our bodies of life, or life, that word being compounded of Tonakaku, the human body, and Quanilt, which signifies a tree or piece of wood, to which is added a particle of local reference, can a doubt remain in our minds that the Mexican borrowed some of their notions about children from the scriptures and had heard of the tree of life, which grew in the Garden of Eden, the fruit of which is said in the 22nd verse of the 3rd chapter of Genesis to confer immortality on the taster? One of the curious and characteristic notices which we have from the Abbey Clavijero, all right, that's a person also, is as follows. Is a primary source from those times. At the foot of the hill is now the most famous church in the New World, dedicated to the true God, where people from the most remote corners assemble to worship the celebrated and truly miraculous image of the Most Holy Lady of Guadalupe, thus converting a place of abomination into a mercy seat where religion has distributed its favors. Speaking of these abominations, he says, the divinity of these false gods was acknowledged by prayers, kneeling prostrations with vows and fasts, and other austerities, sacrifices, and offerings. This is what he was calling an abomination. Things that the Israelites did. Right? Because now he's so happy. What they're saying is because now they got the Catholic word. Now they're worshiping the idol, the Lady of Guadalupe, which was an indigenous deity, which was something they stole and turned into Catholic, Mary, right, of Guadalupe, right? So this is what they were actually doing. This is what they were calling abominations. Wow. They prayed upon their knees with their faces turned toward the east, and therefore made their sacrifices with the door to the west. All right, just like Israelites. This is what they're calling them abominations, and how they're saying they're trying to worship their idols like this. There was a temple, or as the Mexicans called it, House of God, where, continues Clavijero, the king of Mexico retired at certain times for the purpose of fasting and prayer. So why is that an abomination? You guys hear that? The high priest had also a place of retirement within its precincts. There were also within his enclosure a house of entertainment for the reception and accommodation of those strangers who came on devout visits to the temple. There were ponds in which the priests bathed, and a fountain of whose waters they drank. In the pond called Tezcapan, many bathed in obedience to a particular vow made to their gods. The water of one of the fountains was esteemed holy. It was drank only at the most solemn feast. There were places allotted to the rearing of birds for the sacrifices, and gardens in which odoriferous herbs and flowers were used for the altar. All the old historians speak with wonder of the multitude of places of worship. Cortez wrote to King Charles V, a so-called black man, right? Cortez to all these are melanated people. That from the top of one temple he had counted more than 400 towers of others. Listen, they're finding castles, towers, palaces. They found all that here in ancient Teotihuacan, right? Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan in ancient Mexico, all that. So he went to the top and was like, man, I saw way more hundreds of towers after that when I went and saw the whole sight. He's telling his boy Charles V. Of the most ancient, the worthy abbey observes that lofty pyramid raised by the Toltecs remains to this day in that place where there was formerly a temple consecrated to the false deity and now a holy sanctuary for the mother of the true God. And the pyramid, from its great antiquity, is so covered with earth and bushes that it seems more like a natural eminence than an edifice. The pyramid was covered still. We are ignorant indeed of its dimensions, but its circumference of the lower part is more than half a mile. We have reason to believe that that tract of country called Teotihuacan, land of God, was so named for being the possession of the temples. There were besides daily great numbers of free offerings, from the devout of all kinds of provisions, and first fruits, which were presented on returning thanks to for seasonable rains and other blessings of heaven. Again, just like the Israelites, the surplus of the provisions contributed for the maintenance of the priests was distributed amongst the poor, for whom also there were hospitals in all the larger towns. The high priests were the oracles, whom the king consulted in all the more important affairs of the state, and no war was ever undertaken without their approbation. It belonged to them to anoint the king after his election. For incense, they made use of an aromatic gum, but on certain, oh, sorry, I skipped the sentence. Says, so they were the ones who appointed, made the approbation. It belonged to them to anoint the king after his election. For instance, they made use of aromatic gum, but on certain festivals they employed chapopotli, or bitumen of Judea. The censers were of clay or gold. The priests observed many fasts and great austerity of life. They seldom even tasted wine all the time of their ministration. In the temples they were living in separation from their wives. Incontinence was punished with death by bastinado. Those who failed to perform the nocturnal duties of the temple, preparing the fire which was never suffered to go out, had boiling water poured on their heads. Oh my gosh. Many of the Mexican paintings would seem to imply that the Mexicans were acquainted with various books of the Old Testament. They are the book, and had even attempted to express it in brilliant colors and hieroglyphics, the very same metaphors as had been employed by the prophets, whose frequent denunciations of vengeance against the Israelites and other nations on account of their sins might have laid the foundation of a school for painting among the Mexicans, which would convey the same ideas of religious terror to the imagination, but through the medium of another sense. How, it may be demanded, could so many scriptural images and allegories have presented themselves to the minds of the Mexicans? They're like, how can this be? Why do they know so much of the biblical stories? Why are they portraying it in their codices? If they had not had some acquaintance with the forcible language of the prophets, and from what source could they have been derived? That's what they're asking themselves, but they are the sources, what they don't understand, overstand, right? They're seen in reverse. This is the true old world. This is what they found here. And, and going on, what they're saying, continuing, Mexican paintings contain allusion to the restoration of the dispersed tribes of Israel. All right? And we may remark that it is not improbable that the three principal figures in the pages 89-90 of the Lesser Vatican manuscript represented each of them as a sucking infant, no doubt introduced with some mysterious design, may refer to the famous prophecy of the return of the Israelites to their own land. Rejoice ye with Jerusalem, and be glad with her, all ye that love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all ye that mourn for her, that ye may suck and be satisfied with the breast of her consolations, that ye may draw forth with delight of the abundance of her glory. For thus said the Lord, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the influx of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her arms and dandled upon her knees. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. The supposition that the three female figures with infants at their breasts refers to the above prophecy is chiefly founded on the situation which they occupy in the Mexican paintings, which precede and follow them, since the branch is found in the same page as one of the figures, and that Quetzalcoatl slaying the Leviathan or dragon occurs in the next page, which appears to be a consummation of the shadows, types, and symbols with which that and other Mexican paintings abound. And that reference you can have Zechariah 3:8, example 12, version 12 or 6. It says Psalms 50, I think that is 80, Psalms 80, 15, I think, Isaiah 4:2. All right. If I'm wrong, you guys can interpret it yourself. It says in the boat lane library, it's a symbol very much resembling a jawbone, from the side of which water seems to issue forth, which might allude to the story of Samson slaying 1,000 Philistines with such a jawbone, which remained miraculously unbroken in his hand, and from which he quenched his thirst. In the first page of the Borgian manuscript, listen, a remarkable representation of Quetzalcoatl cast forth from the jaws of some amphibious animal occurs, in reference to which curious painting it would be interesting to know whether the Hebrews had any tradition with their Messiah would be devoured by a monster who would afterwards be compelled to yield up his prey, like the serpent in the 75th page of the Lesser Vatican manuscript, which a fierce eagle compels to disgorge a lamb, the symbol of suffering innocence amongst the Mexicans according to Humboldt, which corresponded to the lamb of the Hebrews, all right? And which afterwards was a type substituted for the latter by the Hebrews of Mexico, and referred by them to Quetzalcoatl, in the same manner as their brethren of Peru appeared to have replaced the sacrifice of sheep in the Old World by those of llamas in the New. But llamas are like sheep, right? What they really talking about in the Bible. The former species of animal being unknown to the Indians before the arrival of the Spaniards among them. That's what they say. In Exodus, let's say 19:6, God commands Moses to address the following language to the Hebrews: Ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The Mexicans resembled the Hebrews in being a nation of priests. Jeremiah's apostrophe, I am called by thy name, O Lord, God of hosts. This text may receive some illustration from the following curious passage of Sahagun's history, in which that learned author gives some account of the ancient Toltecas. They were very religious and much addicted to prayer. They worshiped one God, only whom they named Quetzalcoatl, all right? They were very religious and addicted to prayer, giving praise, praying to the Most High. On a particular person with whom the author had conversation, he goes on to say, he was frequently accustomed to declare that there was one God only, and Lord, whose name was Quetzalcoatl, and that he requires no other sacrifices than snakes and butterflies. We here only wish to refer to the 36th page of the present work, example, Antiquities of Mexico, in order to point out the probability that God's promise to Jeremiah, thou shalt be as my mouth, was known to the Mexicans since the newly elected king of Mexico, in prayer of thanksgiving to Tezcatlipoca, there emphatically says of kings, they are thine instrument, and thy images to govern thy kingdoms, thou being in them and speaking through their mouth, and they declaring thy words, right? Just like, a blessed Israelite, who speaks on behalf of the Most High. So that's what they were doing in Mexico. They were praying for their kings to be the same thing, an instrument. The Abbey Clavijero institutes an interesting comparison between the religion of the Mexicans and that of the ancient Greeks, Romans, and other famous nations. He observes the Romans, like the Greeks, showed the opinion they entertained of their gods by the vices which they ascribed to them. Their whole mythology is a long series of crimes. The whole life of their gods was made up of enmities, revenge, incest, adultery, and other base passions capable of defaming the most degenerate of men. All right. So remember, we were talking about, did Hebrews or Israelites become Hellenized, Romanized? Yes, they did. so-called Greeks, huh? The Mexicans entertain very different ideas of their deities. We do not find in all their mythology traces of the least of that depravity which characterize the idols of these nations. So they're saying, but a lot of the stuff, when they're finding, don't resemble the Romans or the Greeks. They're like, these people are more like Israelites. The Mexicans honor the virtues, not the vices of their divinities. The Mexicans believed they had strong aversion to every species of vice. Therefore, their worship was calculated to appease that displeasure which the guilt of man provoked, and to procure their favor and protection by repentance and religious respect. There is not to be found in the rites of the Mexicans the least trace of those abominable customs, which were so commonly blended with those of the Romans and other nations of antiquity. But how could they celebrate the feasts of Venus, Bacchus, Priapus, etc., without such depraved practices? How was it possible for them to have been ashamed of those vices which they saw sanctioned by their own divinities? We confess that their sacrifices were cruel, and the Mexican austerities beyond measure barbarous. The Romans, while under the king, sacrificed young children to the goddess Mania. Authors cited by Suetonius affirm that Augustus, in honor of his uncle, Julius Caesar, who was by this time deified by the Romans, sacrificed 300 Romans. Whoa! Partly senators and partly knights. What Romans, huh? Upon an altar erected to the new deity. Nor were the Spaniards free from this practice. The Spaniards did too. If those Spaniards who wrote the history of Mexico had not forgotten this, they would not have wondered at such sacrifices among the Mexicans. What numbers of men must have been consumed in those hecatombs of the ancient Spaniards? The Mexican sacrifices have been greatly exaggerated by those whose interest it was to defame them. Listen, they exaggerated the sacrifices and a lot of time made it all up. In their inhumanity to their prisoners, the Mexicans voluntarily partook in their own case as the dreadful austerities of the priest and demonstrate. Clavijero dissertation. Emmanuel Mores and Acosta affirms that the Brazilians marry in their own tribe or family. Charlevoix writes of the Hurons and Iroquois that the wife is obliged to marry her husband's nearest kinsman, Star in the West. Beltrami, a literary traveler describing a marriage ceremony amongst the Sioux, adds, the father grants his request on condition of his remaining with him and hunting for him a year longer. Such are the wages of the Sioux. Among the Chippeways, he is not a light liberty to remove till he has obtained offspring of his marriage. Here we find is the case of Jacob and Laban. Just like Jacob and Laban, they had to have offspring. See the letters to Countess Champanoni. Charlevoix, speaking of the northern Indians, observed that the greater part of their feasts, their songs, and their dances appeared to him to have their rise from religion, and yet preserved some traces of it. I have met with some persons, says he, who could not help thinking that our Indians were descended from the Hebrews, and found in everything some affinity between them and that people. Primary source, right? He's living with them. North American Indians, right? There is indeed a resemblance as not to use knives at certain meals and not to break the bones of the beast that they ate at those times. And we may add that they never eat the lower part of the thigh, but always reject it. The separation of their women after the manner of the Jewish. Bertram observes that in every town or tribe there is a resident high priest, usually nicknamed by the Europeans the powwow, the juggler, the conjurer. Besides several of inferior rank, right? The powwow, huh? But that the oldest high priest or seer always presides over spiritual affairs and is a person of great consequence. He maintains and exercises great influence in the state, particularly over the military affairs, their council never determining on an expedition without his sanction and assistance. These people believe most firmly that their priest or seer has communion with powerful invisible spirits, who they suppose have some delegated share in human affairs. He further adds that these Indians are no idolaters, unless they're puffing their tobacco, fume towards their heaven, and rejoicing at the appearance of the new moon, may be termed such, right? They don't have no idol, they're not idolaters, man. They just, praising and meditating, right? It is evident, observes a writer conversant with their customs, that they use the smoke of their kalmut in a sacred manner, as the Israelites did their incense. And as to the new moon, as they reckon their time by it, they are as careful observers of it as the Israelites are. All right? And we read this book, The Star in the West, that they're quoting here. Smith, in his history, observes of the Indians in the year 1681 that their religious solemnity of singing and dancing was performed rather as something handed down from their ancestors than from any knowledge of its origin. They said their great king also created them, and that he dwelt in a glorious land where the spirits of the just should go and live. Their most solemn worship was the sacrifice of their first fruits, in which they burned the fattest buck and feasted together on what else they had collected. But in this sacrifice they broke no bones of the animal. When done, they gathered them very carefully. All right. The same writer assures us that 12 men takes each a stone which they make hot in the fire and place them together after the manner of an altar within the tent, and thereon burn the fat of the insides of the sacrifice. At the same time, they cry to the worshippers outside, "We pray, O praise!" They without answer, "We hear." Those in the tent then cry aloud, "Yoha!" After the fat was offered, some tribes burned tobacco finely cut in imitation of incense. Other tribes chose only 10 men and 10 stones. Dr. Betty visited the Delaware nation, of whom Sir William Penn bears a similar testimony. The occasion of a great council was a proposition whether they should go to war. At this time, says he, they killed a buck and roasted it as a kind of sacrifice on 12 stones, which they would not suffer any tool of iron to touch. Listen, this is what they were observing the Indians do, just like the Israelites, right? They did not eat the middle joint of the thigh. A primary source telling you this. In short, he adds, I was astonished to find so many of the Israelite customs prevailing among them, says William Penn, right? And began to conclude there must be some affinity between them and the Israelites. Remember what William Penn was saying? They're just like the Israelites of England. The Jewish neighborhoods, it reminds him of the Jewish neighborhoods in England before he came. The Muskogee tribe, says Dr. Boudinot, sacrifice a piece of every deer they kill at their hunting camps or near their home. If the latter, they dip the middle finger in the broth and sprinkle it over the domestic tombs of their dead. Charlevoix informs us that to be esteemed a good hunter, a man must fast 3 days without the least nourishment, having his face covered all the time. When the fast is over, the candidate sacrifices to the Great Spirit a piece of each of the animals he intends to hunt. His family and relations do not touch these devoted gifts. They would as soon die with hunger as eat any of them. A people who have lived so long separated from the nations of the earth are not to be wondered at in having forgotten the meaning and end of their sacrifices. That's from Bodinot's Star in the West. Boturini informs us that he discovered one of those knotted cords called by the Peruvian Hipos and by the Mexicans Nepohuatzli in the possession of a powerful lord of the province of Tlaxcalan. It was so consumed by age that it served only to convince me that they had been used, although sparingly. It would appear equally probable that paintings resembling those of the Mexicans had formerly existed in Peru. Listen, paintings resembling those of Mexicans were in Peru. And we've shown that. We've seen images that look just like the Maya and the Peruvians, like resemblance, right? Although consigned to perpetual oblivion by the prudence of those who thought that such documents had better never be brought to light. The same reason may be assigned for Europe after the lapse of 3 centuries, being before the publication of the American monuments of Baron Humboldt ignorant whether the soil of the New World possessed any marks of antiquity. We come, says the commentator of the Antiquities of Mexico, to another precept by which we find from the indubitable testimony of their own paintings that the Mexicans followed more scrupulously the Israelite of the Middle Ages. Thou shalt make 3 fringes from the 4 corners of thy vesture, which could not apply to the girdle. It may be inferred that the square mantle which covered their body is understood, and that was precisely the part of the dress to which the Mexicans fastened fringes. Further arguments, he adds, may appear unnecessary to establish the fact that in military matters, as well as in their civil institutions, the Mexicans resembled the Israelites. It is a remarkable fact which admits of no doubt, the proof of it being found in their paintings, that the Mexicans evinced a predilection for exactly the same numbers as the Jews or Israelites, okay? The attachment of the wandering tribes of the north for their dogs is a proverbial as is their traditional contempt for the term dog. The following notices are illustrative of this peculiarity. The French, accompanied by their Indian allies, came to the state of New York in order to attack the Onondagas, one of the Confederate tribes of that territory, which had espoused, or rather which had been allured into the British interests. On entering the Indian village, they found only a very aged man, the others having fled during the darkness of the night. One of the allies of the French stabbed the old man, who thus indignantly addressed him, "You ought rather to make me die by fire, that these French dogs may learn how to suffer like men. You, their Indian allies, you dogs of dogs, think of me when you come to suffer through them." See Hoyt's Indian Wars. Wow, that was a quote. Listen to that. That's a crazy story right there. Mr. M. McKinney, as an agent of the United States government, writes, "There is hardly anything on which an Indian sets so much value as his dog. This is proverbial, but yet he is constantly referred to as an object of contempt. He illustrates this by an interesting incident of which he was an eyewitness. It was customary to call the nations, because of their lawless excesses, dogs. There is a remarkable instance of this in the prophetic appeal of David, who, seeing by faith that the Romans would be the executioners of the sentence which the religious world of Jerusalem pronounced against the Messiah, thus characterizes that event: "Deliver my darling from the power of the dogs." In the same manner, we find apostate professors designated 2 Peter's 2:22. Isaiah characterizes false teachers as such, and that's 56:11. Isaiah, Philip 3:2, Matthew 7:6. The term is applied to unregenerate characters, as also in 15:27 and Revelations 22:15. Father Joseph Gumilla says in the 59th of the Orinoco Illustrate, "I affirm in the second place that the nations of the Orinoco and its streams observe many Hebrew ceremonies during the time of their paganism, which they followed blindly without knowing wherefore. They had been transmitted by tradition, handed down from father to son, without their being able to assign any reason for the practice of them. There is not that Israelite in existence," he adds, "who holds the flesh of the pig in such abhorrence as these said Gentiles." You see what the Indians, they didn't go near pork, pig. You see what he's saying of the Orinoco people of Brazil. Well, the rainforest there, the Amazon, Orinoco, and different parts, Guyanas, Venezuela, all that, right? They saw the pig, with such as horns, Lafitau and Rockford of the Caribs observe, they reject with abhorrence some of the richest bounties of nature, refusing to eat the hog, the sea cow, the turtle, and the eel, with which their rivers are stored. This motive is added, has been supposed to arise from religious motives, like the Israelites. They don't eat the dirty animals. Listen. Acosta says the garments of the southern Indians are shaped like those of the ancient Hebrews. All right, just like the ancient Hebrews, being a square or talus over a loose coat, see clavijero. Beltrami observes of the ephod, which he found amongst the Indians beyond the Mississippi. It passed from Asia into Greece, thence to Rome, and lastly to these countries. He's saying he found, listen to what he's saying, because he found a thing that he thinks is only from the other side, because it's from the old world, where he thinks the old world is over there. He said it must have passed through all these places before it got here. No, it was been here. What you mean, Greece? What you mean, Rome? Oh, you mean the real ones over here in ancient America, the true old world, right? It says, for this specimen of the short tunic with wide sleeves, which come down to the girdle, is precisely the ephod. That's what the Indians have. That the women should wear necklaces and is not extraordinary. But what does surprise one is that, like the women of antiquity, they offer them to the spirits of their departed relations, of which I have been an eyewitness. All right, primary source, discoverers of the sources of the Mississippi. Edward observes they call their uncles and aunts fathers and mothers, all right, which is a Hebrew custom, and wear their clothes in the fashion of the Hebrews. The history of Western India or Western Indians, what's this? West Indies, the history of West Indies. So, by Edwards. It is not a little singular that the Mexicans should have made use of a cup, in order that by this mode of divination, which Torquemada describes in the following passage of the 40th chapter of the sixth book of his Indian monarchy, they might discover stolen goods, and who the thief was, and where they were concealed, since it will argue some acquaintance with the history of Joseph, all right, with the history of Joseph, one of the Israelite founders, right, of the tribes of Israel, Joseph, Antiquities of Mexico, page 105. The mode of twisting or wringing off the head from the body of birds to prevent death by strangulation is similar to that practiced by the Mexicans in their daily sacrifice, not of young pigeons, but of quails, as we learn from Sahagún, where the phrase is arrancar las cabezas, wrenching of their heads. Gumilla says, anointing with oil and perfumes, which was so peculiarly a Israelite custom that even Christ himself reproaches the Pharisee for being wanting in that mark of courtesy, and which Mary Magdalene excelled, was a usage which continued in such full form on the Orinoco's in South America that it would require a chapter by itself to explain, just a chapter on that alone. You guys see that religious practice, anointing, listen, that it would require a chapter by itself to explain, besides which, if we consider the indispensable obligation which they were under to bathe themselves 3 times a day, staying clean 3 times a day, at least twice, who will not confess that the Indians resemble the Israelites, and shall note down other marks of Judaism? Antiquities of Mexico. Come on now, we're going to get back into Antiquities of Mexico. We haven't even really dug into that. We're going to get into that chapter, book number 6. There's like 9 or 10 books of Antiquities of Mexico by Lord Kingsborough. All right. It says, with reference, it says here, to the cherubic figures born on the four chief standards among the Hebrews, the head of a lion, of a man, of a bullock, of an eagle, of the Arites. At present, indeed, the most numerous tribe generally bears the highest command, but their old warriors assures us it was not so, even in their remembrance. The title of the old beloved man, or Archai Magi, is still hereditary in the Panther family. Ah, Panther, huh? As no lions are found in North America. Well, panther means big cat, silly. They're not talking about lions, but we did have lions. Lions were from here, bigger than the ones in Africa. Lions were here, actually, when they're saying all these ancient world people were, yeah, they had lions. They also had jaguars and all that other stuff, right? The panther is the nearest representation of it. The Indians give a name compounded of celestial and terrestrial to each cherub, which reflects great light on the subject. They call the buffalo, the Indian bull, Janasa, sacred bull, the panther, cat of God, the cat of God, Jaguar, huh? Jaguar, jaguar. In Spanish is jaguar, jaguar. cat of God, the human figure, Yahweh, or holy man, Yahweh, holy man, and the eagle, Ovola, a word compounded of divine power and fire, star in the west. The Hebrews had various ablutions and anointings. The Indians observed the same practice from religious motives. When, writes Adair, the ground is covered with snow, they turn out of their warm lodges, men, women, and children, at the dawn of day, adoring Jehovah. All right, adoring who? Jehovah. At the gladsome light of morn, and thus they skip along, singing his praise till they get to the river. When they plunge in, if the water is frozen, they break the ice with religious zeal. The neglect of this has been deemed so heinous that they have scraped the arms and limbs of the delinquent with snake's teeth, not allowing warm water to relax his stiffened joints. The criminals scorn to move themselves in the least degree, be the pain ever so intolerable. If they did, they would be laughed at by their relatives, first for being vicious, and next for being timorous. A deer in the Star of West, or the Star in West, right? That's where they got that from. The Indian priests and prophets, he adds, are initiated by anointing. They first undergo a medicated vapor bath for 3 successive evenings in a small green hut constructed for the purpose. During that time, they drink only a dilution of snake root to cleanse their bodies and prepare them for their holy beloved offices before the divine being, whom they invoke solemnly by his essential name. After this, their priestly garments and ornaments are put on, bear's oil being poured on their heads. If they could procure olive or palm oil, they would prefer it. The other is the only substitute. See Hope of Israel and Adair. All right, this is from a lot of sources. They're watching the Indians do this, guys. According to the Mosaic law, women after childbirth absented themselves from all society, 40 days for a male, and double that period for a female child. The Muskogee mothers are separated for 3 moons after their delivery, exclusive of that in which the event took place. Baron La Hontang writes, the Indian mothers purify themselves after travail, 30 days for a male child and 40 for a female. The Hebrews became polluted by touching a dead body. The Indians, in order to prevent pollution, when the sick is past hope of recovery, prepare a grave and tomb, anoint his head and paint his face. When his breath ceases, or his breath, ceases, they soon enter the corpse. One of a different family will not pollute himself for a stranger, though when living, he would have hazarded his life for his safety. The relations who become unclean by performing the funeral duties must live apart from the clean several days. Listen to what they had to do, just like the Israelites, guy, around people who were dead. So they had to cleanse themselves for several days after they were the ones in charge of the whole funeral thing, and be cleansed by one of the religious order. See Hope of Israel and Adair. Wailing for the dead was customary among the Hebrews. The antiquity as well as the sacredness of it are manifest. Thus said the Lord, did not thy father do judgment and justice? And then it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy, and then it was well with him. Was not this to know, me says to the Lord? But thine eyes and thine heart are not but for thy covetousness, and for thou too shed innocent blood, and for oppression, and for violence to do it. Therefore thus said Lord, the Lord of Joachim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, they shall not wail for him, saying, Ah, my brother, they shall not lament for him, saying, Ah, Lord, or Ah, his glory. He shall be buried with the burial of an ass, drawn and cast forth beyond the gates of Jerusalem. Bodinot writes, they often sleep over these tombs, which by the loud wailing of the women at dusk of eve and dawn of day on benches close to the tombs must awaken the memory of their relatives very often. Star in the west. It was customary for the Hebrews to bury with the illustrious dead many valuables. Josephus notices this ancient custom when by the treachery of an apostate of the Asmonean family, the Syrian invader robbed the sepulchre of David of 3,000 talents of gold, which had for 1,300 years been entombed with his body. You guys hear that? On the death of the husband, the squaws show the sincerity of their grief by giving away to their neighbors everything they possess. They go out from the village and build for themselves a small shelter of grass or bark, and mortify themselves by cutting off their hair, scarifying their skin, and in their insulated hut they lament incessantly. If the deceased has left a brother, he takes the widow to his lodge after a proper interval and considers her as his wife without any preparatory formality. Hope of Israel, page 208. I have noticed, writes Mr. McKenney in his late tour, several women here carrying with them rolls of clothing. On inquiring what it imported, I learned that they are widows who carry them, and that they are the badges of mourning. It is indispensable when a woman of the Chippewa tribe loses her husband for her to take off her best apparel and roll it up, confining it by means of her husband's sashes. And if he had ornaments, these are put on the top of the roll. This she calls her husband, and it is expected that she is never to be seen without it. If she walks, she takes it with her. If she sits down in her lodge, she places it by her side. This badge of widowhood she is to carry until some of her husband's family shall call and claim it. She is then, but not before, released from her mourning, and at liberty to marry again. Sometimes a brother of the deceased takes her for his wife at the grave of her husband, which is done by the ceremony of walking over it, and this he has a right to do. I was told by the interpreter that he had known a woman left to mourn after this manner for years, none of her husband's family having called for the token of her grief. At length it was told her that one of her husband's family was to pass, and she was advised to speak to him on the subject. She told him she had mourned long and was poor, having no means to buy clothes. Those she had been all the mourning badge Those had been all in the mourning badge, and thus too sacred to be touched. She expressed a hope that her request might not be interpreted into a wish to marry. It was only made that she might be placed in a situation to get some clothes. He answered that he was then going to Mackinac and would think of it. In this state of uncertainty she was left, but on his return, finding her still faithful, he took her husband and presented her with clothing of various kinds. Thus was she rewarded for her constancy. All right, it says this custom is so evidently, however modified, of Hebrew origin. Right, all this they're doing, that's a very Hebrew thing. That it is not a little surprising. McKenney should say he found nothing Israelitish among them except their houses of purification. Their houses of purification. All right. And so that's the end of those two chapters I wanted to read today, guys. It's gonna go on to circumcision and many other topics, you know. But that's what we're gonna read for today. Again, we don't want to make the videos too long, just reading and reading, not showing images. A lot of people get lost. A lot of people, yeah, they just, they can't sit through. And I understand that. It's just hard for me to sit through any video that's 2 hours, unless it's a movie, right? But I appreciate you guys doing it anyways. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I hope you see how many books are telling you the same thing, quoting all these people. Like how many more, how much information, how much history is left out. We're not talking about religion here, guys. I know a lot of you are not down with these videos, but I got to keep it really real. This is history. When we're talking about the 10 tribes of Israel, historically identified with the aborigines of the Western Hemisphere, meaning of the Americas, the true old world, so called Atlantis, all right? All right, body bag for the illusion. We're breaking spells. We remember who we are. The true people are being known because Psalms 83, they said we have to erase them from being a nation. They got Confederate. We have to erase them. And so now we're rewriting them back. We're putting them back into historic times. We're putting them back in the map. These are real people, and these were the people of ancient Americas in general. Yes, the 10 tribes of Israel historically identified with the aborigines of the Western Hemisphere. Thank you for taking the time to come today and hear me read. I appreciate all of you guys. If you were here in the live chat, appreciate you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate if you heard this later on. Uh, Shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Check out my Patreon page if you want to support what I do. Shout out to all my new channel members. Shout out to all the longtime followers. I hope you enjoy and I hope you see because I haven't read this part of this book ever. All right, this is the first time recorded, guys. We've read this book before in old videos, but we've never read these chapters, right? And I just wanted to go back and reread these chapters that we missed. Not reread, but just read the chapters we missed, all right? And you saw all the drop in this book. And we're going to get more info out of this, pull out the babies, touch the hijacks. But in general, as you guys can see, we're talking about real history. We're not talking about religion or just Bible. We're talking about real history, real people, okay? Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow. Thank you.